Hello my dear friends and welcome to StudyIQ. I am Joycey Joy and today in this lecture we will be discussing about corporate bond market in India, and this is with regard to the budget 2019 where the Union government has proposed various measures in order to boost the corporate bond market in India. So we will briefly look at what is the status of corporate bond market in India. We will also see what are the measures proposed in the Union budget and what are the already existing measures and why it is important to boost the corporate bond market in India. So we will discuss all these issues in detail in this lecture, and this is a very important lecture from your UPSC perspective and also from other competitive examinations like bank exams, RBI exams, NABARD, SEBI, etc. So let us start. Let us first understand what is the current affair. So if we analyze the current affair, we will see that the finance minister, while presenting the union budget of 2019, recommended various fresh measures in order to boost the corporate bond market in the recent budget. So the finance ministry, that is the union government, has felt it necessary that it is important to revamp the corporate bond market in India in order to increase the liquidity and also to raise fresh capital. So we will be looking at this issue in detail. What are the recent proposals? What is the existing condition of corporate bond market? And we will also discuss what is corporate bond market as such and what are corporate bonds, why it becomes a debt instrument. All these we will discuss in detail in this lecture. So let us move on. Let us first understand what are corporate bonds. So I will give you a basic understanding about what is meant by corporate bonds. So if we look at raising finance for a corporation, whether it is public entity or a private entity, there are two options for raising finance for an entity. So one can be equity and the other can be debt instrument. So there are basically two instruments. One is equity and second one is debt. So basically the equity shares means that you are selling the shares of the company. The shares are the ownership rights of a company. Now let us take an example where company ABC. Suppose there are total 100 shares for company ABC. And let us assume that two persons, Mr. X and Mr. Y, both of them are holding 50 shares each of company ABC. That means they are the co-founders of company ABC who hold equal number of shares, and total number of shares is 100 shares, of which each of them hold 50 shares. Now they want to raise capital in order to expand their business. So they have two options. One is they can either sell the shares of the company or they can raise capital from debt instruments. So first one is equity, where the company ABC would be selling off certain shares from the total 100 shares to other persons, to the general public, in order to raise more finance for expanding the company. So that is the first option. So it necessarily means that by raising equity shares, the company is selling the ownership rights of the company. Now the second option that is left out is debt instrument. So this is raising finance or raising capital through debt instruments. They are not selling any ownership rights, but instead the company would be paying a specific rate of interest to the issuers of debt instruments, and thereby the company will be raising the capital. So corporate bonds is an example of debt security. So here there is no sale of ownership rights of the company or the shares of the company. Only the company is issuing money or capital from the general public by selling debt instruments, and corporate bonds are an example of debt instruments. So here the company would be paying interest, a specific rate of interest to the issuers. Now secondly, the corporate bonds, they can be either issued by public or by private corporations. So the public entities and also the private entities can issue corporate bonds, and those companies that issue the bonds are called the issuers, whereas those who lend the money, that is those who purchase the bonds, they are called the lenders. Now by issuing corporate bonds, the company can raise finance from the lenders. So here the issuer is the company and the lender is the general public who will purchase these bonds, and instead of purchasing the bonds will provide capital to the company, and the company would instead provide interest to the lenders. So this is how the corporate bonds work. So this is a clear-cut example of a debt instrument, not an equity instrument. So this is the first thing that should be very clear of. Now moving on, let us understand how has been the corporate bond market in India. What is the present status? What is the performance level of the corporate bond market in India? So if we look at the corporate bond market in India, we will see that in the last few years it is stunted. That means there is no progress or much growth in the corporate bond market. So later in this lecture we will analyze what are the reasons for that, and we will also see why there is a stagnation and what can be done, what are the recent proposals of the union government. All this we will discuss. But before that, let us have a picture about the present corporate bond market in India. So if we look at the bond market in India, for the last few decades, it is stunted without much significant growth. And it is not that the policy makers or the regulators like RBI has not come up with any measures. The RBI as well as the policy makers, the union government has come up with various measures in order to revamp the corporate bond market. But even though efforts have been made, the corporate bond market has not made a significant progress. And if we look at the previous budgets which were presented by the union government itself has constituted various committees apart from the committees constituted by RBI, Reserve Bank of India, who is the apex monetary institution in the country. So apart from union government, RBI has also constituted various committees to give recommendations in order to revamp and boost the corporate bond market in India. But if we analyze the recommendations of all these committees constituted by RBI, by SEBI and by the union government, none of the committees' recommendations were fully accepted or they have brought in a change in the corporate bond market in India. So in this backdrop, now the union budget itself is proposing various measures to revamp the corporate bond market in India. So let us look at what are the measures proposed. But before moving on to the measures proposed, let us analyze and understand what are the reasons why the corporate bond market in India has not shown a significant progress in the last few decades. So let us analyze what are the reasons. The first one is low investor base. So here low investor base means that an investor is a person who will purchase the corporate bonds from the issuer. So we have seen in our previous example, the issuer is the company who will issue the bonds to the general public, and the investor refers to the general public who is ready to accept or to purchase this bonds. So low investor base here means that there are very less number of investors who will invest in the corporate bonds. So that is the first reason. So when the investor base is less, the quantum of bonds issued or quantum of bonds purchased will also be very less. Now, if we analyze a group of investors who are interested in making investment in the corporate bond market, they are the FPI. FPI is foreign portfolio investors. So, foreign portfolio investors are one group of investors who are really interested in making investments in Indian corporate bond market. But there is also a limitation to it. Let us understand what it is. Even though the FPIs or foreign portfolio investors are making investments in the corporate bond sector, they make investments as a matter of investment, not as a matter of raising capital for the companies. So here what happens is that they do not trade these bonds. So they keep the bonds with themselves till maturity. Suppose for example a company issues a bond for the maturity period of 5 years at 10% of interest rate. Now in this example 5 years is the maturity period and 10%, that is the interest percentage, is known as the coupon rate. Now in our example, since the maturity period is 5 years, the investor or the lender who purchases the bonds can himself keep the bonds for either 5 years or he has an option to trade this bonds in the market. But for FPIs, what really happens is that they keep this bonds as an investment option and they do not trade this bonds. So what happens? They will keep them till maturity and they do not trade this bonds. So when the trading or the quantum of trading of this bonds come down, it necessarily means that there is lesser liquidity in the bond market. So when trading or number of times these bonds are traded comes down, it indicates that there is lesser liquidity in the bond market. So third reason is that there is lesser liquidity because of lesser number of trading transactions. Now another reason is various stamp duties. It means that at different states, in different states there are different stamp duties for this corporate bonds. So this is also a reason why there is lesser liquidity or lesser trading in the corporate bond market. Now when the union government comes with a uniform stamp duty, with a uniform rate, this issue can be resolved. So these are the major reasons why there is a stagnation in the corporate bond market in India. So these are the reasons. Now let us come to the implications. So with all these reasons and the stagnation in the corporate bond market, how it has impacted the corporate bond market, what are the implications? Let us look at that. Now in the beginning of the lecture we have seen that if a company, whether a private company or a public company, if a company wants to issue capital or raise new capital from the market, it has two options. One is equity and the second one is debt. Now if we look at Indian market or Indian corporate sector, we will see that most of the capital that is raised is through equity resources or through equity shares. But the debt market or the debt instruments in India are not traded very well. But if we look at other developed economies, for example the US economy, we will see that the debt market performs even better than the equity market. That means the corporations in the United States issue more debt instruments than equity instruments. So in India, there is an absence of a well-functioning CBM or corporate bond market. But if we look at developed countries, on the contrary, we see that in the developed countries, the debt market or the debt securities market are better functioning than the equity market. Now, secondly, liquidity in the debt market. So, in developed countries, the liquidity in the debt market is also quite high. We have seen in the past slide that when the trading increases, the liquidity also increases. So in developed economies, the liquidity within the debt market is very high. But in case of India, the liquidity is very less. So that is also another implication. And thirdly, this is putting an extra burden on the government, because we have seen that both private as well as public entities can issue bonds. So these bonds can be issued by the government also. So by raising capital through these bonds, the government is getting an additional finance or a source of capital in order to provide capital for various programs and projects. Now, with the absence of a well-functioning corporate bond market, the government will have an extra burden of raising resources or capital for its infrastructural requirements or for other requirements. So the burden of financing huge infrastructural projects, for example ports, railways, roads, highways, all this falls within the government. Now this has got an implication in the banking sector also. So when there is an absence of a well-functioning corporate bond market, the companies or the corporates will depend on banking sector or banks for raising capital. So what happens? The NPA or the non-performing assets within the banking sector also will increase. This is because of the asset liability mismatch. So due to this, the NPA of the banks will also rise. And thirdly, this will also result in liquidity issues. For example, is the IL&FS crisis. That was a liquidity crisis, and if there was a well-functioning bond market, the crisis could have been avoided. And another impact is that there will be limited investor base and low liquidity. So, considering all these implications and the reasons behind the implications, it is necessary that the regulators, the policy makers should come up with robust policies to revamp the corporate bond market in India. So considering all this, the Union government has recently in the budget 2019 proposed various measures in order to revamp the corporate bond market in India. So let us see what are the measures. The first one is that the Union government has come up with an action plan. So an action plan will be put in place to deepen the bond market in India. And secondly, a special focus would be given on infrastructural sector. For raising finance in the infrastructural sector, a special focus would be given by the government and also by various regulators like SEBI and RBI. Now, regarding FPI, foreign portfolio investors, we have seen that they are one group of investors who really make investments in the corporate bond market. So, in order to increase the quantum of investments from FPI, the government proposed that the FPIs or the foreign portfolio investors will also be allowed to make investments in the infrastructural sector through corporate bonds. Now, most importantly, a credit guarantee enhancement corporation will be set up. So, the function of the credit guarantee enhancement corporation would be to boost the credit rating. So, this will help the companies to boost their credit rating, and by increasing or improving the credit rating of the companies, this will attract large number of investors to invest or to make investments in the bonds of these companies. So this will enable the companies to raise the bonds or raise capital through cheap sources or at cheaper rates. Now, if we look at other measures that are already proposed, that are already in place, we will see that from 2016 onwards, the RBI, Reserve Bank of India, is very keen on developing the corporate bond market in India. So, as a part of this, the RBI had already proposed that bigger companies who raise long-term capital, they should be borrowing a part of their borrowings from corporate bond market. So this was one proposal of the RBI that is already in place. And secondly, those companies that raise funds above 200 crore, that is long-term funds and also huge funds, they should execute it in an electronic platform. This is to increase the transparency of the transactions. So these are the other measures that are already proposed apart from the Union Budget of 2019. So I hope you have got an idea about the corporate bond market in India. You also have understood what are the reasons for the stunting of corporate bond market and what are the implications of it. This is a very important topic for UPSC, and apart from UPSC, for SEBI and RBI preparations, this is very important. If you look at RBI syllabus, you see that finance and management is a very important and integral part of the syllabus. So bond, derivatives, all this comes under the finance of RBI's grade B syllabus, and also for SEBI examination this is very important. Also you should have an idea about all these if you are preparing for any competitive examination, especially banking exams, SSC, etc. So I hope you have an idea about the corporate bond market in India and the measures proposed by government in the recent budget. Thank you.